The locals told him the stone house was cursed, and now he finally understands why. A broke, aging veteran in a red and black flannel jacket spent his last savings on an abandoned mansion buried under winter snow. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a quiet place to disappear with his loyal German shepherd. But on the very first night, his dog froze at the bottom of the stairs, then began barking at a wall that shouldn't exist. Behind it was a hidden chamber sealed for decades, filled with records someone never wanted found. What they uncovered would expose a town's darkest secret, awaken powerful enemies, and force one old soldier to choose between silence and the truth. Sung. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories of loyalty and courage travel. Winter pressed down on Marquette like a held breath, snow swallowing sound wind from Lake Superior, slicing through streets and bones alike. Frank Miller stepped out of his rusted pickup, slowly favoring his left knee, the way he always did when the cold sharpened old injuries, his boots crunching against ice-packed gravel, as he looked up at the stone mansion looming at the edge of town. He was 68, broad-shouldered, despite age, with a body that still carried the square density of a man shaped by years of military discipline rather than comfort. His face was deeply lined, not just by time, but by restraint, the kind earned by men who learned early that emotion could get you killed. A thick gray beard framed a jaw that still looked capable of command, though his eyes told a quieter story. Steel blue, tired, observant, never resting. He wore the same thing he wore almost every winter day, a heavy red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket faded at the cuffs, the fabric softened by decades of use layered over a wool sweater and jeans, patched more from habit than poverty. People often mistook Frank for a man with nothing left to lose, but that wasn't true. He had simply learned to live with less noise inside him. Behind him, Rex climbed down from the passenger seat with deliberate care. The German shepherd was nearly 10 years old, his muzzle dusted with gray, his body still powerful but leaner, now built for endurance rather than speed. His coat was a deep sable dark along the spine, lighter at the legs, scarred faintly in places where shrapnel and debris had once kissed too close. Rex did not rush, did not wag, did not bark. His ears rotated slowly, mapping the silence. This was not a pet's hesitation. It was a veteran's pause. Frank noticed immediately. Rex had moved through Fallujah under mortar fire without freezing, had walked past burning vehicles without hesitation. But here, in the quiet of a Midwestern winter, the dog stopped cold. Frank followed Rex's gaze to the mansion itself. Pale stone walls rose 3 stories high, stained by time, and snowmelt windows dark and unblinking, as if the building were watching him back. The county clerk had called it a formality property seized after decades of unpaid taxes, unwanted, unloved, sold for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Frank had not asked questions. He had learned long ago that some doors only opened if you didn't knock too hard. He crouched beside Rex, gloved hand resting briefly on the dog's shoulder, feeling the subtle tension there. Rex's tail hung low, not tucked, his stance rigid, one paw hovering slightly above the snow, a posture Frank recognized from Iraq from the moments before. Rex had saved lives by refusing to move. "Easy, boy." Frank murmured, his voice gravelly, unused, but steady. Rex did not respond. His nose lifted, drawing in the air, and for a brief, unsettling moment, Frank felt the same tightness creep into his chest that used to come before roadside scans and convoy halts. He straightened and turned back toward the house, forcing himself forward, because forward was what he had done his entire life. The porch groaned under his weight, the sound sharp in the muffled stillness, and Frank noted it automatically, cataloging weaknesses, the way he always did: wood integrity, sight lines, entry points. Habit, not paranoia. The key the county had given him slid into the lock far too smoothly. The door opened without resistance, whispering inward, releasing air that was stale but dry, untouched by rot. Inside, dust floated lazily in pale columns of winter light, filtering through half-closed shutters. The foyer was vast, with a curved staircase sweeping upward, banister polished beneath the grime, as if someone had gripped it not long ago. Frank paused, his breath fogging faintly, listening. Silence answered, but it was the kind of silence that felt arranged rather than abandoned. He stepped back onto the porch and looked at Rex. The dog had not crossed the threshold. Instead, Rex paced in slow, controlled circles near the truck, calculating, reassessing, eyes flicking between the door and the tree line behind the house. Frank frowned. Rex had slept through artillery. He had never refused shelter. "All right," Frank said quietly, more to himself than the dog. "We take it slow." He picked up his duffel and stepped inside again, the house swallowing the sound of his boots. When Rex finally followed, it was with measured reluctance, every muscle engaged, nose sweeping the baseboards as they moved. The living room opened wide to a stone fireplace matching the exterior, a neat stack of firewood arranged beside it, too precise to be coincidence. Frank stared at it longer than necessary. That symmetry unsettled him more than decay ever could. The kitchen was a museum of another era, harvest gold appliances, linoleum, curling at the corners, but the refrigerator was unplugged intentionally, and a calendar hung crooked on the wall, frozen on a date from years too recent to fit the county's narrative. Frank felt something shift inside him, a subtle recalibration. He told himself it was nothing. Old houses held echoes. People left things behind. But Rex froze near the back hallway, body-stiff ears pinned forward. A low growl vibrated in his chest, controlled, restrained, the sound of warning, not fear. Frank stopped instantly, his hand dropping instinctively toward a belt that no longer held a sidearm. He followed Rex's focus to a blank stretch of wall, no window, no outlet, nothing to justify attention. Rex stepped closer and scraped the baseboard with one paw. The sound echoed hollow. Frank knelt, fingers brushing the paint, noticing a subtle difference in texture, thinner, newer. His pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with recognition. This was the feeling before something went wrong. He straightened slowly, exhaled, and rested his forehead briefly against the cool plaster. He had come here for quiet, for an ending, measured in seasons instead of missions. He had believed he could outwalk his past by choosing a place no one wanted. Rex sat beside him, unwavering eyes locked on the wall, as if guarding a truth that refused to stay buried. Frank closed his eyes for a second, listening to the wind outside the lake, the house breathing around them, and understood. Something he had spent years avoiding, peace was never found by ignoring danger. It was found by facing it calmly, step by step, with the right partner at your side. Frank did not sleep that first night, not really. He lay on a folded blanket near the cold stone fireplace, boots still on jacket unbuttoned, but never removed. Listening to the house settle in slow, deliberate sounds that did not feel random. Winter pressed against the walls from the outside, but inside the air felt contained, preserved like a room sealed after someone held their breath and never let it go. Rex stayed awake as well. The German shepherd positioned himself at the edge of the back hallway, his body angled toward the smooth wall he had marked earlier, chest low to the ground, ears rotating in small, precise movements. His amber eyes never closed. Frank had seen that look before in deserts where silence meant danger, and in moments when instinct spoke faster than thought. When dawn finally leaked through the shutters in thin, pale bands, Frank rose slowly, joints stiff, mind clear, in the way it only became when he accepted that something was wrong. He brewed coffee on a camp stove set on the kitchen counter, the smell sharp and grounding, and watched Rex from the corner of his eye. The dog had not moved. After the mug was empty, Frank walked to the hallway and placed his palm flat against the wall. Up close, the surface told a story the eyes could not. The plaster here was smoother, the paint less cracked, the coldness beneath his skin uneven. He knocked once with his knuckles. Hollow. He knocked again farther to the left. Solid. The difference was unmistakable. Frank exhaled through his nose slow and controlled the way he used to before cutting wire or clearing a doorway. He fetched the small pry bar from his truck, returned and knelt. Rex stood immediately, stepping back just enough to give space but never looking away, his tail stiff with restrained urgency. Frank worked carefully, peeling back plaster in controlled motions, each flake falling softly onto the floor like dead skin. Beneath it, a seam appeared vertical and deliberate, a line that did not belong to any honest structure. He wedged the bar and applied pressure. The panel resisted, then shifted with a muted groan, releasing a breath of cold, dry air that smelled faintly of paper and dust. Behind it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. Frank paused at the threshold, listening, counting heartbeats, letting the years of training do their work. Rex moved forward without command, not reckless, not afraid, simply certain. The steps creaked, but held, leading them into a space that felt too finished to be a cellar. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled in neat block handwriting. Shelves held rolled maps, boxes stamped with dates, and a desk positioned under a single lamp that was unplugged but intact. Frank swept the flashlight beam, slowly cataloging. No signs of rot, no mold, no signs of haste. This was not a hiding place. It was an office abandoned by choice. Then he saw the jacket. It hung from a hook above the desk, wool thick and dark, military, cut older than his own service gear. Frank reached out, fingers brushing the collar, and found the name stitched inside: Walter Hughes. The letters were faded but legible. Frank's jaw tightened. Hughes had been the mayor of Marquette for nearly 2 decades, a man known for his public smiles and private silence, declared missing 7 years ago after a supposed boating accident on Lake Superior. Presumed dead. Funeral held. Case closed. Yet here was his jacket, preserved, deliberate waiting. Rex let out a single, sharp bark, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, the kind used to mark a change in conditions. Frank turned instinctively just as the sound of wood shifting echoed faintly from above. The front door closing. They were no longer alone in the house. Frank did not chase the sound. He did not shout. He extinguished the flashlight, counting seconds, letting darkness settle. Rex stood beside him, hackles raised, but body forward, breathing controlled. After a long minute, Frank guided them back up, resealing the panel as best he could, smoothing the broken plaster with his gloved hand until the damage blended into neglect. Whoever had entered the house had done so quietly and left just as carefully. That afternoon, Frank drove into town. The snowfall had eased, leaving streets edged with gray slush and faces hardened by routine. At the general store, he met Sarah Kowalski, the cashier, a woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones and pale skin weathered by years of lake wind. Her dark hair was pulled into a low, practical bun, streaked prematurely with gray, and her posture carried the tension of someone who listened more than she spoke. She glanced at Frank's jacket, then at Rex, lingering just a second too long. "You're the one who bought the stone place," she said, not a question. Her voice was flat, careful. Frank nodded once. Sarah's lips pressed together. "That house hasn't been empty as long as people say," she added quietly, sliding his receipt across the counter. When Frank asked what she meant, She shook her head, eyes flicking toward the door. "Just don't start knocking on walls," she said. "Some things stay quiet because they have to." Back at the mansion, Frank found the final confirmation. The jacket was gone. The hook above the desk was empty, undisturbed, no other items missing. Rex stood at the top of the stairs, panting lightly now, tension breaking through discipline. Frank closed the panel fully this time, sitting on the floor beside it, the weight of the truth settling in his chest. Someone had been there. Someone was still watching. He did not feel fear. He felt clarity. The life he had come here to escape had found him anyway, wearing a different uniform but playing the same game. Frank rose, checked every lock, and placed a chair beneath the front door handle. Rex resumed his position in the hallway, sentinel and partner. Outside, the wind returned, carrying snow off the lake, erasing tracks, covering evidence. Inside, the wall stood silent again, but it no longer fooled either of them. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm that Frank recognized too well, the kind that masqueraded as normal while quietly sharpening its knives. Rex did not sleep at night anymore. He lay near the base of the staircase, body stretched, but coiled ears twitching at every subtle change in the house's breathing eyes, reflecting firelight long after the flames had died. Frank noticed the way the dog's ribs rose and fell more quickly than usual, the way his paws shifted slightly, as if testing traction on unseen ground. During the day, Rex followed Frank closely, not crowding him, but keeping himself positioned where he could see both Frank and the hallway, at once a living perimeter that moved without commands. Frank himself slept in fragments, drifting for minutes at a time, before waking with his heart steady but alert, his mind already cataloging sounds, the tick of cooling stone, the whisper of wind along the eaves, the distant groan of ice shifting on the lake. On the third morning, Frank returned to the hidden room with a notebook and camera, intending to document everything before more pieces vanished. He found the filing cabinets exactly where he had left them, drawers aligned, dust undisturbed, but when he opened the second cabinet from the left, his breath caught. A folder labeled Shoreline Reassignment 1998 was gone. He checked again, then again, slower this time, fingers tracing the edges of remaining files as if the missing one might slip back into place through sheer insistence. It did not. There were no scuffs on the floor, no fresh dust displaced, no fingerprints on the metal handles. Whoever had taken it knew how to move through a space without leaving a trace. Frank straightened and closed his eyes for a moment, not in disbelief, but in recognition. This was not theft. It was maintenance. He resealed the panel and climbed back into the house proper, where Rex met him halfway, nose lifting to read Frank's face. "They're still coming," Frank said quietly, more statement than fear. Rex's tail stiffened once, then settled. That afternoon, Frank drove back into town under a low sky the color of old steel. He stopped at the marina first, scanning bulletin boards layered with faded flyers and notices curling at the corners. An older man watched him from the dock, tall and narrow, with a long gray beard braided loosely at the tip, and a fisherman's stoop carved by years of wind. His name was Thomas Hale, though everyone called him Tom, and his eyes were pale and sharp, beneath bushy brows, the kind that had learned early to look past surfaces. When Frank asked about Walter Hughes, Tom's hands paused mid-knot. "Hughes didn't drown," he said flatly, not looking up. "Men like that don't slip and vanish. They plan." Tom's voice carried no drama, only fatigue, the tone of someone who had seen too many endings rewritten. He explained that years ago, several families along the shoreline had been forced to sell land for public access improvements projects that never materialized. Complaints were filed, meetings held, and then people stopped talking. One man lost his job. Another moved away overnight. Tom himself had been fined into silence after a safety inspection suddenly found fault with his boat. "The house you're in," he added finally, meeting Frank's eyes that was Hughes's anchor. Everything flowed through it. Frank thanked him and left without pressing further. He had learned when to stop asking. At the general store, Sarah Kowalski rang up his supplies with hands that trembled just enough to notice. The fluorescent lights washed her pale skin to a dull sheen, emphasizing the fine lines around her eyes that came from watching too much and speaking too little. She leaned closer as she slid the receipt across. "People are noticing you," she said under her breath. "That dog, the jacket, the house. You're stirring old water." Frank studied her face the way her jaw tightened when she said old. "Why don't you leave?" he asked. Sarah smiled without humor. "Because my father didn't," she replied, and that was all she offered. Back at the mansion, the tension thickened as evening fell. Rex paced more now, occasionally stopping to sniff the air near the front door, then the back, then returning to the staircase as if pulled by an invisible line. Frank cooked simply canned stew heated on the stove, eating slowly, deliberately, the way he had learned to do when adrenaline threatened to hollow him out. After dark, the house shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint creak above, not the settling of old beams, but the careful transfer of weight. Rex froze mid-step, head snapping up, a low growl forming, but never escaping. Frank reached for the flashlight and waited. Seconds stretched. Then came the sound of paper moving, distant, deliberate. Not rummaging, sorting. Frank moved quietly to the base of the stairs, every muscle alert, and listened. The sound stopped. A door opened somewhere above hinges, barely whispering. Then nothing. When Frank finally climbed the stairs, weaponless but ready, he found the upstairs study exactly as he had left it, except for one detail. A ledger he had not noticed before now sat on the desk, placed squarely in the center, as if for emphasis. It was old, leather-bound, its pages yellowed but intact. Frank did not open it immediately. He stood there for a long moment, Rex beside him, both of them staring at the object like it might breathe. When he did open it, the entries were methodical names, dates, parcels, approvals. Many were initialed W.H. Others bore stamps from offices Frank recognized from his father's old stories. One entry was circled in red pencil, the paper indented by pressure Miller survey adjustment. Frank's chest tightened, not with panic, but with a slow, rising anger that had nowhere to go. The ledger was not evidence left behind by accident. It was a message. "You see this? We see you." Frank closed the book and returned it to the desk exactly as he had found it. He did not take it downstairs. He did not hide it. He understood the rules being laid out. That night, Rex refused to leave the upstairs hallway. He lay directly in front of the study door, his body blocking it, eyes open, breathing steady. Frank sat against the wall opposite him, his back to the cold plaster, and let himself remember the convoy outside Ramadi, where silence had meant someone was watching from the rooftops. He remembered the lesson he had learned too late back then. When someone wants you to know they're there, it's because they believe you can't stop them. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and persistent, erasing tracks, smoothing edges, pretending the world was gentler than it was. Inside the stone house, Frank accepted the truth Rex had known from the beginning. This place was not abandoned. It was occupied by a past that refused to stay buried, and it had finally noticed him standing in its doorway. Morning arrived without light, the sky over Marquette sealed in thick gray cloud snow falling not in flakes, but in a fine, relentless grain that erased edges and softened the world into something deceptively quiet. Frank had not slept. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, gone cold, eyes fixed on the narrow gap beneath the staircase where Rex had refused to look away since dawn. The German shepherd stood rigid beside him, head lowered, ears angled forward, his body no longer tense with warning, but with certainty. This was different from before. Rex was not reacting to a sound or a scent that drifted in and vanished. He was waiting. When Frank finally rose, joints protesting, Rex moved first, padding to the stairs and stopping halfway, turning his head just enough to confirm Frank was following. Behind the staircase, where shadow gathered thicker than it should have, Rex pressed his nose against the wall and inhaled deeply, then scratched once, precise, controlled. Frank knelt and felt it immediately, the faint draft of cold air seeping through stone that should have been solid. He slid his fingers along the baseboard until he found a section where the wood flexed under pressure. The workmanship was better here than the first hidden panel, older, reinforced, built by someone who intended permanence. Frank worked slowly, removing screws by hand, easing the panel free without breaking it. The wall swung inward to reveal a narrow passage descending sharply, the air inside colder than the rest of the house, sharp with the smell of metal and old paper. Rex did not hesitate. He moved down with quiet confidence, nails clicking softly against stone. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber larger than the first. Its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelving, packed tight with boxes, binders, rolled blueprints, and photographs sealed in yellowing plastic sleeves. This was no office. It was an archive. Frank's flashlight swept across labels written in careful block letters, dates spanning decades, departments he recognized from his father's old stories. County survey, shoreline development, emergency rezoning. He stepped closer, heart slowing into a heavy, deliberate rhythm, the kind that came before bad news you could no longer avoid. Rex stopped in front of a low shelf and sat, eyes fixed on a single box, as if marking it. Frank lifted the lid and felt his breath leave him. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of men standing beside tripods and measuring rods, survey stakes planted in frozen ground. One face leapt out immediately. Henry Miller, Frank's father. Younger, leaner, dark hair thick beneath a wool cap, his jaw strong, his posture straight with the quiet pride of a man who believed in rules. Frank's chest tightened. Henry had been declared dead 22 years earlier, after his truck was found submerged near a ravine, ruled an accident, brought on by ice and fatigue. Frank had accepted that story because he had needed to. Now here was proof his father had been alive long after that winter. Frank sifted through documents with trembling hands, reading signatures he recognized. Seeing his father's name appear again and again, beside objections, notations, warnings filed and ignored. One memo stopped him cold. Recommendation: removal of obstruction. The date was 2 weeks before Henry's supposed death. Frank closed his eyes briefly, the memory of his father's voice rising unbidden, calm, principled, always telling him the truth mattered even when it cost you. When Frank gathered the most critical files into his bag, Rex's head snapped up a low growl, vibrating through his chest. At the same moment, the overhead light flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator upstairs cut out, plunging the house into sudden silence. Frank froze. Then he smelled it. Gas. Faint at first, then unmistakable, seeping into the cold air, like a threat whispered too close. Out, Frank said quietly. Rex moved instantly, leading the way back through the passage. As they emerged into the kitchen, the stove hissed softly, one burner lit, though Frank knew he had turned everything off. He lunged forward, twisting the valve shut, throwing open windows despite the cold, his breath fogging as adrenaline sharpened his movements. Outside, the wind carried the scent away, snow whipping through the open frames. Someone had cut the power. Someone had turned the gas back on. This was no warning anymore. It was escalation. Frank stepped onto the porch, scanning the grounds. Fresh snow lay smooth and untouched, except for a single set of boot prints leading from the tree line toward the rear of the house, already filling in as the storm worked to erase them. Rex stood at Frank's side, hackles raised, eyes tracking the path until it vanished into white. Frank returned inside and locked every door, then sat heavily at the table, the weight of realization settling fully at last. His father had not died by chance. He had been erased. That evening, as darkness returned early, a knock sounded at the door, firm, deliberate. Rex moved between Frank and the sound stance, wide, silent. Frank opened the door to find Sarah Kowalski standing on the porch, snow clinging to her coat, her dark hair loose now, whipping around, a face gone pale with urgency. Up close, Frank saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the way fear and anger had aged her faster than time. "They cut power to the north side of town," she said without preamble, her voice tight. "Just yours and 3 others. All people who filed complaints years ago." Frank let her in. She looked at Rex with something like gratitude. "My father worked with yours," she added quietly, eyes dropping to the floor. "He tried to stop them. After he died, I learned how to keep my mouth shut." Frank nodded once. He did not need more. Outside, the snow fell heavier, burying tracks, burying years, burying truth. Inside the stone house, surrounded by evidence and silence, Frank finally allowed himself to feel it fully, not fear, not grief alone, but resolve. They wanted him gone. They wanted him quiet. Instead, he would stay, and this time he would not be erased. Frank waited until the storm loosened its grip before making the call. He sat at the heavy oak table in the stone house, documents spread in careful stacks, each page weighted down by a mug, a book, a pocket knife, small acts of order against chaos. Rex lay near the front door, his body angled toward the porch, chin resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded, but never unfocused. Age had slowed him. The once jet-black fur along his muzzle had turned a salt and pepper gray, and one ear now drooped slightly from an old injury. But his presence filled the room with a quiet authority that no alarm system could match. Frank dialed the number Sarah had slipped him on a torn receipt, her handwriting tight and angular, as if even the ink had been afraid to linger. Emily Carter answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was calm, measured, the kind shaped by years of listening to people who were afraid to speak. Emily was in her late 30s, Frank would later learn, tall and spare with a runner's build and posture that suggested forward motion even when standing still. Her hair was a light brown, usually pulled into a low ponytail, practical rather than styled, and her eyes, sharp, hazel, had the restless intensity of someone who slept too little because the truth rarely waited for daylight. When Frank told her what he had, she did not interrupt. She asked precise questions, requested copies, and said only, "I'll come tonight." She arrived just after dark in a dust-covered sedan, her coat dusted white at the shoulders, a canvas satchel slung across her body like a shield. Rex rose the moment her headlights cut across the snow, but he did not bark. He sniffed the air once, then stepped back, allowing her to approach. Emily noticed. She always noticed. "That dog trusts you," she said quietly, as Frank let her in. "That means more than references." They worked through the night. Emily photographed documents, cross-checked names, traced land transfers through shell companies and dead-end corporations. She spoke little while reading, lips pressed, thin jaw tightening when patterns emerged. By dawn, the outline was unmistakable. Walter Hughes had built an empire by erasing objections, burying dissent beneath paperwork and fear. Henry Miller's name appeared again and again, always at the margins, always pushing back. Emily closed the final folder and looked at Frank. "Your father tried to stop this," she said, "and they stopped him instead." The article went live 2 days later. Emily did not publish locally. She went regional, then national, letting the story move faster than anyone could contain. The headline was blunt, unsparing. Within hours, calls flooded the county offices. By evening, Walter Hughes was gone, his lakeside house empty, his accounts frozen, his name suddenly toxic. This time there was no funeral, no ceremony. He vanished the way men do when there is nowhere left to hide. What followed surprised even Frank. On the third day after publication, a woman knocked on the Stonehouse's door just after noon. She was in her 70s, short and stooped, wrapped in a wool coat too large for her frame. Her hands shook as she held out a manila envelope. "My husband worked with Henry," she said, eyes shining with something like relief. "He kept these. In case." Then another came, and another. Men and women. Frank had passed in town without a second glance, arrived quietly. Some alone, some together, carrying boxes, folders, photographs. They spoke in fragments, voices low, glancing toward the road, as if expecting it to object. Rex sat on the porch, throughout rising only to reposition himself when someone approached his presence, steadying them, a reminder that they were not alone. Frank did not sell the house. He did not leave. He reinforced the locks, installed lights, and turned the hidden rooms into something new. The archives were cleaned, catalogued, opened to scrutiny. Emily returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with colleagues, her confidence growing as the truth solidified into something undeniable. Sarah Kowalski came by one evening with coffee and a tentative smile, her shoulders finally easing, as if she had set down a weight she had carried too long. Winter passed into a reluctant spring. Snow melted into streams that ran along the stone foundation, carrying years away grain by grain. Rex grew slower. He spent more time lying in the sun, when it appeared his breathing deeper, his movements measured. But he never abandoned the porch. Children began to sit on the steps, asking Frank about the dog. Veterans came leaving coins, medals, quiet nods. Frank watched it all with a stillness he had earned the hard way. He understood now what the war and age had been trying to teach him all along. Truth could be buried. Names could be erased. But loyalty, real loyalty, stood its ground. And some guardians never left their post. Sometimes what we call a coincidence is simply God working quietly in the background. A man finds a house no one wants. A dog senses what eyes cannot see. And a truth buried under years of silence finds its way back into the light, not through force, but through faith, loyalty, and patience. In our everyday lives, we often pray for miracles that arrive loudly. But more often, God sends them softly through a loyal companion. A moment of courage or the strength to stand when walking away would be easier. This story reminds us that truth has a heartbeat and loyalty has a voice. When we choose to stay honest, to protect what is right, and to love fiercely, even when it costs us, God meets us there. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've ever experienced a moment where faith carried you through when nothing else could. And if you believe, as we do, that stories of courage and loyalty still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. These stories travel farther when we walk together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path. May He watch over your home, your loved ones, and every loyal heart that refuses to turn away from the truth. Amen.